A man murders his neighbor over a land dispute. He flees, then returns. Not with a weapon, but with a roasted goose. The victim's family accepts the meal, and suddenly the crime is forgiven. No trial, no prison, just a strange ritual, and a shared dish. In parts of medieval Europe, this wasn't folklore, it was law. Today, we uncover the bizarre, forgotten system where justice could be bought, not with gold, but with supper. A man lies dead in a muddy field outside. His village, his killer, a neighbor, stands not before a judge, but before the victim's family, holding out bread, ale, and a slaughtered pig. The family accepts the offering. No prison, no gallows. The killer walks free. This isn't mercy, it's law. In early medieval England, this system was known as wergild, literally, man payment. It was a codified compensation paid to a victim's family in gold, livestock, or goods, based on the value of the person's life. The higher the status, the higher the payment. Killing a noble might cost 1,200 shillings. A chel, a free peasant, only 200, a slave, far less. In some regions, meals served as symbolic fulfillment of these obligations, especially where formal currency was scarce. These customs weren't unique to England. Across early Germanic Europe, from the Lombards in Italy to the Franks in Gaul, comparable traditions appeared. The Lex Salica, a 6th century Frankish legal code, lists precise fines for murder, injury, and even insults, replacing vengeance with structure. And within those settlements, the act of sharing food, a public reconciliation meal, often finalized the transaction. It wasn't just about paying a price, it was about restoring peace. In Saxon law, refusal to pay wergild could trigger a blood feud, a cycle of revenge that might last generations. But if the killer offered compensation, and if the victim's kin accepted, the slate was wiped clean. In some cases, it wasn't just coin. A feast, a public oath, or even a symbolic embrace could serve as legal closure. Law and custom blurred, with local assemblies, moots serving as the stage for negotiation. This wasn't a fringe practice. Wergild appears in the laws of Athelbert, the earliest English law code, issued around the year 602. There, everything had a value from a man's life to the cutting of hair. Payment brought order, and in many villages, a shared meal marked the end of conflict, watched by elders, sanctioned by tradition among Scandinavian peoples. Similar customs thrived under GRGs, the medieval Icelandic law code. Blood money and symbolic gifts were central tools in preventing long-term feuds. Again, meals often played a part. In tight-knit farming communities, where everyone knew everyone, peace had to be practical. In a time before professional police, standing armies, or prison systems, these arrangements were not an alternative to justice. They were justice. Crimes weren't seen purely as offenses against the state, but as ruptures in personal and communal bonds. Repairing those bonds, sometimes over food, was a legitimate legal act. Over time, kings and centralized governments would attempt to suppress these customs, replacing them with uniform criminal codes. But for centuries, justice across much of Europe didn't begin with an arrest. It began at the table in early medieval England. The value of a human life could be measured in shillings. The concept was known as wergild man price. It wasn't symbolic. It was the law, codified as early as the 7th century under King Athelbert of Kent. The wergild system outlined exact amounts a killer owed to a victim's kin. A freeman's death might cost 100 shillings. a nobleman's could exceed 300. Injuries, too, had set prices from the loss of a finger to the breaking of a bone. This wasn't a moral judgment. It was a structured attempt to prevent feuds. The foundation of Wergeld rested on a society without prisons, police, or centralized judicial enforcement. In such a system, revenge was the default. If someone was killed, the victim's family had the right, and often the duty, to avenge the death. The payment of Wergeld offered a way out. It shifted justice from vengeance to compensation, from retaliation to settlement. But the value of the payment depended entirely on status. In the laws of issued in the late 7th century in Wessex, a churl, a common freeman, was worth significantly less than a thane, a nobleman. Slaves were treated as property, with their deaths compensated not with Wergeld but with restitution to their owners. In this legal structure, human worth was not equal. The law reflected a rigid social hierarchy, and payment ensured peace, not fairness. But compensation didn't always come in coin. In many localities, especially where formal currency was limited, gestures replaced metal. A prized animal, a crafted weapon, or even a communal feast could fulfill the spirit of Wergeld if the victim's kin accepted it. Public reconciliation, witnessed by elders and sealed by shared food, became a social contract. Across Europe, similar systems existed long before state law dominated. Among the Salian Franks, the Lex Salica prescribed payments for everything from theft to homicide. The Lombard laws in Italy followed the same model. Compensation was precise, recorded, and publicly enforced, but not by the crown. Justice was communal. It was negotiated, not imposed. The Norse called it beta fines, or reparations. Iceland's laws detailed how disputes should be settled through arbitration and payment. Even the early Irish Brehon laws operated on this logic. In nearly every tribal system, what mattered was restoring balance within the group, not punishing offenders in isolation. This model of justice only worked where communities were small, personal, and interdependent. A killer and the victim's family were rarely strangers. They shared fields, churches, and bloodlines. Maintaining harmony took precedence over moral absolutes. But as monarchies expanded and centralized power grew, this system came under pressure. Kings demanded that crimes be seen as offenses against the crown, not just the individual. The rise of royal courts, written decrees, and permanent jails would eventually render Wergeld obsolete. Still, for centuries, this was justice, not imposed by state machinery, but negotiated through shared customs and sometimes a shared meal. In parts of early medieval Europe, justice wasn't always sealed with ink or blood. Sometimes it ended with a meal. Among many Germanic and Scandinavian communities, the concept of reconciliation extended beyond compensation. When a person was killed, whether by accident, conflict, or crime, it wasn't uncommon for the perpetrator or their kin to offer not just silver or livestock, but a public feast to the bereaved family. These gatherings weren't banquets of celebration. They were somber, symbolic rituals. The act of breaking bread together served a distinct legal and social function. Once the meal was accepted, the grievance was closed. Retaliation was no longer lawful. This practice shows up repeatedly in local customs and law codes across the continent. In early Iceland, under the GRG's laws, formal feasts often followed private settlements. The slayer or his family might host a meal for the victim's relatives, serving meat, ale, and bread as part of a broader restitution. The gathering was public, and its purpose was unmistakable. It marked the end of enmity. If the meal was accepted, the right to vengeance expired. The lex Alemannorum, a legal code from the 8th century Alemanni of what is now southwestern Germany, outlines similar practices. Here, beyond the required compositio, the monetary payment for a killing were communal gestures that involved offering food, wine, or animals. While not mandated by the text, they appear in surviving charters and annals as part of a broader peacemaking ritual. In some Anglo-Saxon regions, meals could serve a role not just in reconciliation but in reinforcing community approval. A moot or village assembly might witness the feast. Acceptance wasn't only emotional, it was legal. Once both families shared the table, the matter was considered resolved in the eyes of the community. This wasn't limited to the upper classes. In village life, where formal enforcement was minimal and feuds could spiral out of control, these feasts acted as a form of preventative justice. They discouraged long-term blood vengeance, a dangerous threat in tight-knit societies where retaliatory violence could fracture entire clans. But these rituals weren't entirely about remorse. There was also strategy. In places without strong royal authority, legal enforcement relied on cooperation. Feeding the family of the deceased was a signal. The killer or his kin sought reintegration, not conflict. For the grieving family, accepting the food meant more than forgiveness. It was often survival. Continued feuding risked further loss of sons, land, or allies. Ale, in particular, held symbolic weight. Among the Frisians and Saxons, shared ale was seen as a binding act, akin to swearing an oath. Drinking from the same vessel was more than courtesy. It was a form of mutual submission to peace. In several 9th century cases recorded by Carolingian scribes, restitution payments are listed alongside notations about communal meals, often with mention of local priests, elders, or even royal officials in attendance. These meals blurred the lines between justice and ritual. They weren't only expressions of remorse, they were public agreements, enforced by memory, witnessed by many, and designed to stop the blood from flowing further. In a fragile world held together by personal bonds, sometimes a shared table held more power than the sword. In theory, early medieval justice allowed for reconciliation. In practice, it often favored those who could afford it. Under the Wergold system, the cost of a crime was tied directly to the status of both the victim and the offender. A noble's life was worth far more than a commoner's, but what mattered just as much was the ability to pay for the elite. Compensation, even for a killing, could be handled with livestock, gold, and ceremony. For a peasant, the same offense might mean ruin. Historical records from 9th century Wessex show that the wergold of a nobleman, or thane, could reach 1,200 shillings. A cerel, the lowest class of freemen, was typically valued at 200. In the event of a crime, the payment wasn't optional. If the offender couldn't afford it, they faced exile or retaliation. This created a stark imbalance. Wealthy offenders had options, poor ones had none. In the Frankish kingdoms, the same patterns held. The Lex Salica offered precise values for injuries, property damage, and homicide. But it also made room for non-monetary settlements. Nobles could host large gatherings, offer prized horses, or commission feasts that doubled as public apologies. These events, recorded in Carolingian charters, served as both restitution and display, a calculated offering that symbolized remorse while reinforcing the the power and generosity of the host. There are cases where this system was stretched to its limit. In 10th century Saxony, a nobleman named Eckhard of Megan killed a man during a land dispute. Rather than face a formal trial, he paid the family in cattle gifted to parcels of land, and arranged a feast at the village church. The bishop signed off on the settlement. The crown never intervened. For Eckhard, justice was not only affordable, it was negotiable. For commoners, the same path was far less accessible. If a peasant committed a similar act, they would likely face outlawry, loss of land, or forced servitude. In some regions, inability to pay wergeld meant the entire kin group became liable. Families were driven into debt or forced to negotiate unfavorable terms, and few could offer a meal elaborate enough to sway public opinion. By the 11th century, church authorities began voicing concerns. Ecclesiastical councils condemned the use of lavish feasts in place of penance, especially when it seemed to enable repeat offenders. A council in Mainz in 1028 criticized local lords who paid silver and served wine, but left justice undone. The church's objection wasn't only moral, it was political. Forgiveness, if it could be bought, undermined the growing authority of canon law. In communities where survival depended on cohesion, forgiveness rituals helped prevent feuds. But when one class could routinely bypass punishment through wealth or spectacle, the line between reconciliation and manipulation blurred. The same meal that ended a feud in one case could, in another, reinforce inequality and leave true justice unfinished. By the early Middle Ages, the Christian Church had become an inescapable presence in legal and moral life. Its influence reached deep into village disputes, clan feuds, and even acts of murder. When it came to reconciliation, customs, especially those involving meals and compensation, the Church took a complex, often contradictory stance. Some clergy supported these rituals. They saw value in peace over bloodshed. In an age when secular justice could trigger endless revenge cycles, church leaders advocated for mercy, penance, and forgiveness. Public meals, when tied to repentance, were interpreted as Christian acts of charity. A killer who offered livestock or bread to the victim's family and confessed his guilt might also be ordered to fast, donate to the poor, or make offerings to the church. Mercy wasn't just a social choice. It was framed as a path to salvation. In the Penitential Theodori, a 7th century handbook used by priests in Anglo-Saxon England, instructions are clear. If a man kills another, he should seek reconciliation, not only through wergeld, but also through confession and ecclesiastical penance. Here, church doctrine didn't replace customary law. It overlapped with it. A reconciliation feast could be paired with a prescribed period of fasting or pilgrimage, but support was never unanimous. In other corners of Christendom, especially among reform-minded clergy, these rituals raised concern. Some bishops viewed the public feasting and symbolic settlements as remnants of pre-Christian tribalism. The Church Synod of Clovershow in 747 denounced heathen practices that blurred moral clarity. To these critics, exchanging food for forgiveness undermined both justice and doctrine. It risked making sin a transaction, something to be paid off with gifts, rather than confronted through true repentance. Tensions grew as church power expanded. As early as the 9th century, bishops in the Carolingian Empire began intervening in local disputes, replacing village assemblies with ecclesiastical courts. The aim was to formalize justice under Christian authority, to steer it away from what they considered arbitrary or superstitious rituals. In this process, many traditional customs, including forgiveness feasts, were marginalized or outright banned, yet even as doctrine hardened, practice varied. In rural regions far from cathedrals and royal halls, old customs persisted, often with the blessing, or at least the silence, of local clergy. The church didn't fully suppress these traditions. It absorbed them, reshaped them, and sometimes used them as tools of influence. In the long transition from oral law to written canon, the church played both roles, mediator of peace and enforcer of order. It offered moral justification for reconciliation, but also demanded authority over the terms. In early medieval Europe, justice was not only a matter for men. In certain regions, particularly in Germanic and Scandinavian territories, women, especially widows or close female kin of the victim, played a decisive role in whether reconciliation could even take place in these societies. The death of a male family member placed legal and social weight on the surviving household. If the victim left no father, son, or brother, it was often the mother or widow who stood in their place. Her role wasn't symbolic. Her word could determine whether the killer was hunted or forgiven. Among the Saxons and Lombards, sources suggest that women were permitted, and at times expected, to participate in public negotiations around Wurgeld. In 9th century Saxony, a widow's acceptance of a reconciliation meal was treated as binding. It was equivalent to a legal waiver of vengeance, even if male relatives disagreed. In the Carolingian heartlands, bishops recorded several instances where women who received compensation in the form of livestock, grain, or prepared feasts publicly declared satisfaction. Once done, the case was effectively closed. This authority, however, came with expectation. Women were often positioned as the guardians of peace, responsible for preventing ongoing bloodshed. In Scandinavian Iceland, for instance, the sagas, though semi-literary, reflect historical attitudes that placed pressure on women to either uphold honor through revenge or preserve kinship through forgiveness. In legal terms, if a woman accepted a meal from the offender's family, she had declared an end to the conflict. To later pursue retribution would violate custom and law. But the weight of these decisions was not always equal. The social expectation that women prioritize harmony could become a tool of coercion. A widow refusing a meal might be viewed as stubborn or disruptive. A sister who demanded reparation in court rather than accepting a feast might be accused of undermining village peace. These cultural pressures blurred the line between voluntary forgiveness and forced submission. Ecclesiastical records from 10th century Francia mention priests mediating these cases, often emphasizing the spiritual virtue of female mercy. Forgiveness was praised as Christian virtue, especially when expressed by women. Yet this praise came with a cost. The burden to restore peace often fell more heavily on the shoulders of those already grieving. In some regions, though, women used this role to assert power. The laws of in 7th century Wessex contain provisions that allowed widows to collect full compensation. In cases where she refused, vengeance remained legal. Her choice stood as final. These episodes reveal a layered reality. The image of medieval justice as male-dominated overlooks how rituals of food, forgiveness, and reconciliation placed women in central and often uncomfortable roles. Where meals served as verdicts, women could be both arbiters of peace and protectors of honor. Across medieval Europe, the final hours before an execution followed more than legal protocol. In many regions, the condemned were offered a last meal, not as an act of mercy, but as a ritual loaded with meaning. In Anglo-Saxon England, some executions were delayed until the prisoner had been granted bread and ale. This custom wasn't codified in royal law, but it appears in local chronicles and church writings. The meal served a symbolic purpose. It prepared the soul for death. Sharing food, even in chains, was seen as a humanizing act, a final gesture before life was taken by the state. In the Frankish territories under Carolingian rule, the church's growing influence shaped execution rituals. Priests would often be present to hear confession, administer last rites, and when permitted oversee the giving of food. The Capitulaire de Viliers, a legal and administrative document from Charlemagne's court, emphasized the spiritual responsibilities of officials toward the condemned. Redemption, not just punishment, was the goal. A final meal accompanied by confession and absolution created a path for the condemned to die reconciled with God. In certain Germanic customs, particularly among the Saxons and Alemanni, a final meal could delay execution altogether. In rare but documented cases, if the condemned was still eating when the executioner arrived, the act was postponed until the meal was finished. This was not out of respect. It was ritual. The moment of death was not to be rushed, especially if the condemned had not completed the symbolic process of release. These meals varied. Sometimes it was simple bread and water. Other times, especially for high-status prisoners, it included meat, wine, or sweetened cakes. The content of the meal reflected not only status, but the cultural fusion of punishment and penance. Food became a tool of ritual closure. In Scandinavia, sagas and early law codes describe feasts held by kin of the condemned in the hours before execution, not to protest the sentence, but to mark the transition. A public sharing of food reinforced that the person was still part of the community, even as they were being removed by force of law. Unlike the earlier forgiveness feasts, this was not about absolution from the victim's family. It was about the condemned's relationship with the divine. Food at the threshold of death became a bridge between body and soul, law and faith, punishment and peace. Even in punishment, ritual held its place. The last meal didn't erase the crime, but it gave the condemned one final moment of dignity, and in the eyes of many, a final chance at redemption. In the fractured political landscape of early medieval Europe, law was rarely written in stone and almost never enforced by a distant king. In most villages, there were no police, no permanent courts, and no state-controlled prisons. Authority, when it existed at all, was local, personal, and fragile. In this context, justice had to be practical, not ideal, not universal, just workable. Communities were built on kinship and survival. A violent feud between two families didn't just affect the guilty and the aggrieved, it threatened the entire settlement. A single killing could ignite a chain of vengeance that would drain fields of laborers and children of fathers. To prevent this, societies turned inward, developing customs that emphasized reconciliation over retribution. The hearth, not the sword, became the center of justice. In households from Northumbria to Bavaria, peace was preserved not with formal sentencing but through social negotiation. A roasted animal, a keg of ale, and a crowded hall full of witnesses often did more to end a dispute than any royal decree. This wasn't because communities were forgiving by nature. It was because they had no better option. Feuds were destructive, unpredictable, and destabilizing. The cost of letting blood run freely was too high. The goal wasn't fairness in a legal sense. It was containment. A system had to exist where violence could be absorbed, not perpetuated. Shared meals after killings weren't soft alternatives to justice. They were structured responses to instability. They functioned as peace contracts, often sealed in the presence of elders or local clergy. Once the victim's family accepted the offering, a pig, bread, or a symbolic feast, they were bound by honor and law to halt vengeance. To break the peace was to invite collective condemnation, sometimes even exile. These customs thrived in places where the crown's hand couldn't reach. The Carolingian Empire issued law codes, but enforcement was inconsistent. In rural Francia, manorial courts often deferred to community norms. In Anglo-Saxon England, kings like Alfred the Great issued laws that supported work guild, but left its execution to the families and local hundreds, decentralized units of governance. The idea that a crime was an offense against the state had not yet fully taken hold. Crimes were viewed as ruptures in the social fabric. Repairing that rupture was a communal responsibility. Payment in goods, gifts, or shared ritual restored balance more reliably than execution or imprisonment, neither of which was feasible. On a wide scale, by the 11th century, monarchs began centralizing legal authority. Prisons were slowly constructed. Judges traveled under royal banners. But before that system emerged, justice had to serve the village first, not the king. It had to prevent feuds, protect labor, and keep the peace with whatever tools that people could afford: a cooked animal, a shared drink, a public gesture. These weren't symbols of weakness. They were the architecture of survival. By the 12th century, the world around the village hearth began to change. Kings were no longer distant figures issuing symbolic edicts. They were building courts, sending judges on circuit, and asserting that crimes were no longer just personal injuries. They were offenses against royal peace. In England, the shift accelerated after the Norman conquest. Under William the Conqueror and his successors, royal authority expanded rapidly. By the time of Henry II in the 12th century, legal reforms such as the Assize of Clarendon formalized the king's role in criminal justice. Juries of presentment, royal justices, and central record-keeping began to replace local assemblies. The system no longer relied on whether a victim's family accepted a meal or a gift. It depended on the crown's determination of guilt. The same process unfolded across continental Europe. In France, under Philip II and later Louis IX, the Parliament of Paris and other royal courts claimed jurisdiction over serious crimes. The Ordinance of 1254 declared that no private person could settle a homicide without royal consent. The message was clear: forgiveness could no longer be bought with bread and ale. In the Holy Roman Empire, imperial reformers sought to end feuding altogether. The Peace of Mainz in 1235 and the Landfrieden laws that followed banned private vengeance and required all disputes to be brought before official judges. Local customs that once prioritized reconciliation over punishment were now classified as obstacles to order. Church courts, too, added pressure. As canon law expanded in the 12th and 13th centuries, it increasingly condemned informal settlements that bypassed confession, penance, or ecclesiastical review. Ritual meals without spiritual oversight were dismissed as remnants of pagan superstition, or as corruptible loopholes in justice. But the transition wasn't swift or universal. In the Scottish Highlands, parts of Wales, and across rural Scandinavia, forgiveness, feasts, and informal restitution arrangements continued well into the 1600s. In Iceland, local assemblies known as wing retained aspects of older reconciliation. Customs, even as Danish rule, imposed stricter codes. In parts of the German countryside, villages still marked the end of feuds with food offerings or symbolic handshakes overshared. Drink long after such practices had been outlawed by princely courts. These were not acts of defiance, but habits rooted in centuries of necessity. The disappearance of forgiveness feasts wasn't the result of one law or one ruler. It was the slow erosion of a decentralized world, replaced by bureaucracies, prisons, and a vision of justice no longer negotiated, but imposed. Long before courtrooms and criminal codes, justice was negotiated with gestures, not gavels. A roasted animal in a village square, ale poured into shared cups, words spoken not in accusation, but in reconciliation. These were not remnants of a primitive world. They were solutions born of necessity, in a time when vengeance was real and survival fragile. Modern systems claim impartiality through structure, charges, evidence, verdicts, sentence. But those older customs understood something different, that justice is not just about resolution, but about restoring balance. Not punishment for its own sake, but peace that could be seen, tasted, shared. Were they perfect? No. Wealth and influence could tip the scales, just as they can now. Women were pressured to forgive. The poor often lacked the means to participate. But in those moments when a grieving family sat across from the offender's kin and chose a meal over a feud, something powerful took place. Not mercy handed down from above, but a choice made by those most wounded. Could such a system work? Now, probably not. Too many people, too much distance between harm and resolution. But the question lingers. In a time of surveillance, incarceration, and legal machinery, has justice become more objective, or just more remote? The forgiveness feast has vanished. The Wurgeld has been replaced by sentencing guidelines. But the need to repair what violence breaks remains. Justice by the hearth is gone. Yet its echoes remain, not just in tradition, but in the deeper question of what justice is for, to punish the wrongdoer or to stop the next wound from being made.